All right, so are you ready to dive deep?
Oh, I'm always ready for a good deep dive.
Well, perfect, because today we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been curious about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, end times prophecy, specifically the rapture and the second coming of Christ.
Ah, the big questions.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we're turning to the work of Tim LaHaye. Have you heard of him?
Oh, absolutely. A pretty influential figure in prophecy circles.
Yeah, his books have really made waves. And trust me, some of this stuff is mind-blowing.
I can imagine. Where do we even start with something as massive as end times prophecy?
Well, we're going to try to condense things, clarify the key points, and really focus on what's most intriguing.
Sounds good.
Think of it like your express lane to understanding this complex subject. No traffic jams here.
I like the sound of that. No getting bogged down in the details.
Exactly. So right off the bat, LaHaye makes a pretty bold claim.
Oh, let's hear it.
He says that fulfilled prophecies are like proof, a giant cosmic signpost pointing right at God.
Interesting. Almost like a divine seal of authenticity.
Yeah, like case closed, God exists. He even pulls out this quote from Isaiah 46:9-10. You know, where God's basically like, I've been calling the shots since the beginning and I know how it all ends.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember that passage. It's pretty powerful stuff.
And then to back that up, he hits us with the fact that over 500 biblical prophecies have already come true.
Okay, that's a lot. Makes you wonder about the ones that haven't happened yet, doesn't it?
Right. It's like building this reputation for accuracy, you know?
Yeah, establishing a pretty impressive track record.
Right. But of course, some might argue that these so-called fulfilled prophecies are open to interpretation. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's a fair point. Prophecy can be complex, multi-layered. Interpretation isn't always a straightforward thing, right?
Right.
Take the prophecy about the destruction of Tyre, for example. Some people argue it wasn't completely fulfilled as predicted.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
But then LaHaye points to the historical record, Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre, and eventually the total destruction of that island city, just as Ezekiel predicted centuries earlier.
Wow.
Pretty striking example, if you ask me.
Yeah, it really is.
Oh.
Okay, so let's say we take that track record seriously.
Uh-huh.
What does the Bible say is coming next? What's on the prophetic horizon, according to LaHaye?
Well, he takes us straight to Jesus' own words in John 14:1-3.
I'll go.
Where Jesus promises his disciples that he's preparing a place for them.
Yes.
And that he will return to take them there.
Oh, that's a powerful image, isn't it? Like a reunion, coming home.
Definitely. And to a place built by Jesus himself, no less.
Wow. So it's not just any home.
Not at all. And LaHaye doesn't stop there. He digs into those specifics. Talks about the many mansions in the Father's house.
Yes.
He even mentions Dr. Henry Morris.
Okay.
Who calculated that the New Jerusalem, just one part of heaven, could hold a mind-blowing 20 billion people.
20 billion people.
Can you imagine?
It's hard to wrap your mind around, isn't it?
Definitely. It really is. It makes you wonder, though, who gets to enjoy those mansions? Who's invited to this incredible place?
That's a great question. And I think LaHaye's pretty clear that it's not about earning your way in. It's about accepting Jesus as the only path to salvation.
Right. Grace, not works.
Exactly. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I mean, I know the question on everyone's mind is when. When is all this going to happen?
Oh, of course. The million-dollar question.
Right.
And LaHaye acknowledges that we can't know the exact day or hour, of course. But he says we can see signs.
Signs.
Yeah, what he calls shadows of expectation in current events.
Okay, shadows of expectation. I like that. But what are these shadows? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. Well, he points to things like the rise of Russia as a military superpower.
Okay, yeah.
Links it to the prophecy in Ezekiel 38:39. Describes a future conflict where God intervenes, and as a result, many turn to him.
Wow, that's intense.
It really is. It's almost like he's saying, look around, folks. This isn't just random chaos. There's a bigger picture at play here.
Yeah, so he's connecting these seemingly unrelated events to this larger prophetic narrative.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He brings up global economic woes,
Oh, yeah.
particularly capital and labor conflicts. He even mentions the super sign Israel becoming a nation again in 1948.
Oh, wow.
Emphasizes how miraculous this is, Says no other nation has ever come back after being dispersed for 1,850 years.
It really is an incredible thing when you think about it.
Definitely a head scratcher for historians, that's for sure.
Definitely. And then There's all this talk about travel and knowledge increasing like crazy.
Oh, yeah, that's another big one.
He links that to Daniel 12.4. And it's true, isn't it? It's like someone hit fast forward on technology and globalization.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. But with all this talk about the end times, it's easy to get lost in the terminology.
Oh, for sure.
Terms like rapture and second coming get thrown around a lot.
Right.
But are they the same event?
Ah, yes. That's where things can get a bit tricky. LaHaye clarifies that they are not two separate events, but rather two distinct phases of Christ's return, like two acts in a cosmic drama.
Oh, I like that analogy. Two acts.
He explains that the rapture is Act 1.
Okay.
It's sudden, happens before the tribulation, and it's all about believers being taken to safety.
Wow.
Then you have the second coming, Act 2.
Okay.
Which involves the Battle of Armageddon, the ultimate showdown against the Antichrist.
Yeah.
And then the establishment of a 1,000-year kingdom of peace.
Wow. So it's like a two-part event with a very dramatic intermission.
You could say that.
And LaHaye provides 15 distinctions between the two, emphasizing they cannot occur simultaneously. It's almost like he's giving us a sneak peek at God's divine schedule, wouldn't you say?
It is a pretty fascinating perspective and detailed.
Yeah.
But it does make you think, what about those who are left behind after the rapture?
Yeah.
What happens to them? Do they face, certain judgment?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another intriguing concept, the judgment seat of Christ. This is where things get really personal.
Oh, yeah.
So we were just talking about the judgment seat of Christ. Sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
Is this where we're all held accountable for like every little thing we've ever done wrong?
Well, LaHaye clarifies that this judgment, it's not about deciding if we go to heaven or not.
Oh, okay.
That's settled, when we accept Christ.
Right.
This is more about evaluating the quality of our works as Christians, the things we did, in service to God. He even pulls out 7 Corinthians 5.10 to back this up.
So it's less like a pass-fail test and more like what a performance review.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. LaHaye talks about these crowns as rewards for faithfulness. He even cites scriptures like 1 Corinthians 9.27 and Revelation 2.90. But he also warns against, selfishness and laziness, suggesting they can actually rob us of potential rewards.
Wow. Okay. So it adds a whole new level of motivation to live a life that honors God.
Right. Definitely. But it does make you wonder, though, why would God even allow a period like the tribulation to happen? Why all the suffering?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
It is. LaHaye addresses it head on, though. Reminds us about the fall in Eden, how sin entered the world, and how we've been dealing with those consequences ever since.
Like that original domino effect.
Exactly. But what's God's purpose in all this, in allowing the tribulation? Is it just about punishment?
Right.
Well, LaHaye suggests it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Sees it as like a final wake-up call, a time of intense pressure to, turn people towards God.
So even amid the judgment and suffering, there's this like redemptive aspect to it.
Absolutely. And he points out that there are still opportunities for salvation during the tribulation, even for those who weren't raptured. He mentions the 2 witnesses, the 144,000 Jewish evangelists, and others spreading the message of Christ.
That's pretty remarkable. Even in the midst of chaos and turmoil, God's still working to draw people to himself. But okay, if the rapture happens before the tribulation, what about those who die in the meantime? What happens to them?
Yeah, good question. LaHaye tackles this by looking at what happens to Christians when they die. He uses the example of the thief on the cross who repented and asked Jesus to remember him.
Oh, right.
And Jesus' response, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Luke 23.42-43, highlighting that for believers, death isn't the end. It's a transition to being with Christ.
Paradise, that sounds nice. But what form do we take? Are we like ghosts? Do we have bodies? Can we still interact with our loved ones who've passed away?
Well, LaHaye points to Philippians 3.2-21, suggesting our resurrected bodies will be like Christ's after his resurrection. And if we look at the gospel accounts, Jesus was recognizable, could communicate, even enjoyed a meal.
Oh, wow. So no Casper the Friendly Ghost situation then. We get to keep our personalities and maybe even enjoy some heavenly cuisine.
That seems to be the idea. And as for connecting with loved ones, he brings up the story of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16.2-31. While they were separated by this great gulf fixed, they could still communicate. It's a fascinating glimpse into the afterlife.
Definitely raises more questions than it answers, but it's comforting to know relationships continue in some form. But let's go back to the rapture happening before the tribulation. I mean, some people might be skeptical. It's been a long time. How can we be really sure Jesus is coming back at all?
Well, LaHaye presents a few arguments for the certainty of Christ's return. First, Jesus himself promised it, and his words are eternal. Second, the 109 prophecies about his first coming, all fulfilled exactly as predicted.
It's like God saying, I always deliver, check my track record.
Exactly. And to back that up further, LaHaye points out there are over 300 prophecies about the second coming. Then every New Testament writer mentions the second coming. It's central to their writings. Finally, he argues all biblical prophecy, whether about the rapture or the millennial kingdom, points towards this climactic event of Christ's return.
Okay, so we've got Jesus' own promise, fulfilled prophecy, and the consistent message of the New Testament writers. That's pretty convincing. But there's debate about when the rapture happens, right? Some believe it happens at the very end of the tribulation, just before Jesus sets up his kingdom, the post-tribulation view. But LaHaye's firmly in the pre-tribulation camp, yeah.
He is. He really dives into the specifics of John 14:1-3, where Jesus first mentions the rapture. LaHaye argues that the language here, it mirrors Paul's description in 1 Thessalonians 4:1-18. He even cites the late Mennonite commentator J.B. Smith, who did a detailed comparison of the two passages, found striking parallels in the wording, the sequence of events.
So it's like they're describing the same event, but from two different perspectives.
That's what LaHaye suggests. And to further support the pre-tribulation view, he points to scriptures that specifically say Christians will not go through the tribulation, like 1 Thessalonians 1:10, where we're told Jesus delivers us from the wrath to come, and 1 Thessalonians 5:9-10, stating God did not appoint us to wrath, but to salvation through Christ.
So if we're not appointed to wrath, we're probably not going to be around for the tribulation, right?
That's the argument, and he really drives this home with Revelation 3.never. Jesus promises to keep believers from the hour of trial that'll come upon the whole world.
Makes sense. But if we're not going through it, why is the tribulation happening? 7 years is a long time.
Well, LaHaye references Daniel 9.24, outlines 6 reasons for the tribulation: to finish transgression, make an end of sin, make reconciliation for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is, and beyond those specific reasons, he suggests it's also a merciful act from God, a final opportunity for people to turn to him before it's too late.
So even amidst judgment, there's that redemptive purpose. But this brings up another question. Why does God bind Satan for 1,000 years after the tribulation, only to release him again? It seems a bit counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But LaHaye suggests it's part of God's plan, demonstrating the depth of human sinfulness and our ultimate need for redemption. He points to Revelation 20, where during Christ's millennial reign, Satan's bound, can't deceive the nations.
So like a temporary timeout for evil, allowing for peace and righteousness.
Yeah, that's the idea, but why release him at all? Wouldn't it be better to keep him locked up?
Right.
It's a question worth pondering. LaHaye's perspective is that even after 1,000 years of experiencing Christ's rule, some will still choose to follow Satan when he's released. This final rebellion, it highlights the stubbornness of the human heart, the ultimate futility of rejecting God.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. But what about those who miss the rapture? Can they still be saved during the tribulation?
LaHaye believes there are still opportunities for salvation during the tribulation, as long as people don't take the mark of the beast.
The mark of the beast. That's a pretty ominous term. What does that even entail?
Well, we'll dive into the specifics a bit later, but essentially, it's a symbol of allegiance to the Antichrist, a rejection of God's authority. LaHaye suggests taking the mark, it's a point of no return, a conscious decision to side with evil.
So even during the tribulation, there's a choice to be made?
Yes. And he points to evidence that God will continue working in people's hearts during that time. He brings up the 144,000 Jewish evangelists in Revelation 7 who will preach the gospel and lead a multitude that no man can number to Christ.
Wow, so even amidst the darkness, God's light will shine through. But okay, if the rapture happens before the tribulation, how do we reconcile that with Paul's reference to a last trumpet in 1 Corinthians 15:58?
Yeah.
Isn't that talking about the trumpet judgments that happen during the tribulation?
Good point. LaHaye clarifies that the last trumpet Paul mentions, it's specific to the church, signaling their departure. It's distinct from the 7 trumpet judgments directed at the unbelieving world during the tribulation.
So 2 different alarms going off, one for the church and one for the world.
Exactly.
But couldn't you argue it's all the same event, just described differently?
It's definitely a point of debate. But to further strengthen the pre-tribulation argument, LaHaye offers a final, what he calls slam dunk argument.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the slam dunk?
He argues that if the rapture happened after the tribulation, Just before Jesus sets up his millennial kingdom, there would be no one left on earth to populate it.
Oh,
Remember, believers in heaven have glorified bodies. They no longer procreate.
right. Traded in their earthly concerns for heavenly pursuits.
Exactly. So if everyone is either raptured or judged at the end of the tribulation, there's no one left in natural bodies to, have children and continue humanity during Christ's 1,000-year reign.
That's a really good point. Creates a bit of a logistical problem, doesn't it?
It does. And that's why LaHaye is so confident in the pre-tribulation rapture. It allows for both the preservation of believers and the continuation of humanity during Christ's kingdom.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. We've covered so much. Prophecies, timelines, judgment, rewards, the millennial kingdom.
It's a lot to process. But there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle we need to explore.
And what's that?
Israel's role in the end times.
Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle that last piece of the prophetic puzzle, Israel's role in the end times. And I got to say, from what I've read, LaHaye is, pretty passionate about this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He starts off by, acknowledging that everything we hold dear as Christians, it all stems from the Bible. And the Jewish people, they played a vital role in bringing that to us. They're the foundation.
It's true, yeah. Without them, we wouldn't have the Old Testament, the prophecies, or heck, even the story of Jesus. It's all intertwined.
Exactly. He even points out that many early Christians, they were Jewish. And for the first few centuries, the church was, largely led by Jewish believers.
It's interesting how sometimes those early connections, they get kind of overlooked. But then LaHaye kind of shifts gears and he starts talking about America's relationship with Israel.
Oh, yeah.
He brings up that covenant God made with Abraham way back in Genesis 12.3.
Right.
Promising to bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse her.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And he even suggests that America's historical support of Israel has contributed to its blessings and prosperity. He even implies that, waning support for Israel could have some negative consequences for the nation.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but I'm sure some would argue that a nation's foreign policy shouldn't be tied to receiving God's blessings.
Right.
Couldn't you make the case that it's about individual righteousness, not political alliances?
That's definitely a valid perspective. But LaHaye's really focused on the spiritual implications of how nations treat God's chosen people. He sees it as a matter of, obedience and alignment with God's will.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. He also really dives into, this incredible fact of Israel's very existence. He reminds us that no other nation in history has been, dispersed from its homeland for centuries and then returned to reestablish itself.
Yeah, it's unheard of.
It is. And he calls it the super sign of the end times, emphasizing that its rebirth as a nation in 1948. That's a clear indicator that we are living in, prophetically significant times.
Yeah, you can't really argue with the, the historical uniqueness of that.
It's like a giant exclamation point in history.
There really is.
But what about those who, interpret these prophecies symbolically rather than literally? Like, what about those who say that the Israel in prophecy, refers to the church, not the actual nation?
Well, LaHaye strongly disagrees with that viewpoint. He really advocates for a literal interpretation of prophecy when it comes to Israel. He emphasizes, the historical and geographical specificity of the promises that God made to Abraham and his descendants.
So Jerusalem isn't just some abstract symbol. It's a real place with a real significance in God's plan.
Exactly. He believes that God still has this unique purpose for both the church and Israel, trying to, merge them or erase one in favor of the other. That's, in his view, a distortion of biblical prophecy.
Makes me think about those who try to, downplay Israel's role in the end times. LaHaye seems to be saying that's kind of a dangerous path to go down.
He does, and he goes even further. He suggests that the best way to understand, where history is headed, it's to watch what God is doing with Israel. It's like a prophetic compass pointing us towards the culmination of his plan for humanity.
Wow, that's powerful. So where does that leave us? We've covered prophecies, timelines, judgment, rewards, Israel's role, the rapture, the tribulation. It's been quite the journey.
It has. We've explored some really, challenging concepts, and we've tried to grapple with those implications. But ultimately, it's up to each, individual to wrestle with these ideas and come to their own conclusions.
And I think we've done a pretty good job of laying out LaHaye's perspective and giving our listeners plenty to think about. Before we wrap up, I've got one final question for you. Something to ponder as you continue exploring this topic. What stands out to you about the idea that even during the most difficult times, there's still opportunity for people to turn to God?
That's a great question to end on. LaHaye reminds us that God's grace, it's always available, even in the midst of, judgment and suffering. The tribulation, while a time of hardship, it's also a period of intense spiritual awakening, a final call to repentance before the fulfillment of God's plan. It's a reminder that, it's never too late to turn to God, to choose hope over despair, and to embrace the promise of redemption.
It's a powerful message of hope, isn't it? Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Tim LaHaye's insights on the end times. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we hope this has given you a better understanding of this complex and fascinating topic.
Remember, this deep dive, it was just a starting point. There's so much more to explore.
Exactly. And we provided the map, but the journey, that's yours to take. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Pages to Dialogues. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found valuable insights to apply to your life. If you did, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, Pages to Dialogues, for more thought-provoking dialogues on Christian books. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on this episode. Please leave a comment below, and let's continue the conversation. If you know someone who would benefit from our discussions, please share this episode with them. Your support means the world to us. Finally, if you appreciated this episode, please give us a thumbs up and a like. It helps us reach more people and continue creating content that inspires and uplifts. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to engaging with you on our next episode of Pages to Dialogues.